This is Developmental Editing, and we're going to go ahead and have everybody introduce themselves real quickly. I'm Brittany, your moderator. I'm a freelance editor, and let's go ahead and start with Amy.
Hi, everyone. I'm Amy Michelle Carpenter, and I'm a developmental editor with Eschler Editing, and I'm an author. This is my book, Becoming Human. It's YA sci-fi, and that's the genre I like to edit as well.
Perfect. Thanks, Amy. Let's go with Emma next.
Hi, I'm Emma Heggem. I am the managing editor at Future House Publishing, which means I work with the acquisitions and the content editing, as well as managing the later stages of editing, but that's not really relevant to this particular panel. And then I have done some freelance editing as well, developmentally, on science fiction, fantasy, and middle grade adventures.
Awesome. Thank you. How about Kristy?
I'm Kristy S. Gilbert from Loose Leaf Editorial and Production, and I'm a book editor and book designer. And I work primarily with science fiction and fantasy, and I've been doing that for about 10 years.
I'm Nic Nelson. I'm the founder and head coach of Wordsmith Writing Coaches. We started out as an academic coaching outfit and academic editing, and helping scholars translate their dissertations for trade publication. But then we got into book editing too, and so we've been doing fiction and nonfiction, everything from children's picture books to memoirs to Western and science fiction and fantasy. And we've been doing the full range of books for 15 years now, and we've been in business for about 17 years.
Awesome. Well, I'm so glad you're all here. These are all incredibly experienced and wonderful editors, so you'll learn a lot from them today. So let's get started. And since we're talking about developmental editing, hopefully a lot of you have been to other panels where you've learned a little bit more about the different levels of editing. So let's go ahead and define what developmental editing is and kind of the things you can expect to happen in this phase of editing. So anybody can go ahead and take a stab at that.
I'll start. Developmental editing is not about your grammar or your punctuation or about even some word choice, but it's not nitpicking over every single little word. Developmental editing is when you look at the broad stroke elements like your character and your plot and your pacing and like the overall tone of your book, whether it's appropriate for your intended audience, like their age group, things like that. So in a developmental edit, changes can go as big as like this character needs to go away and this chapter needs to be rewritten. Or maybe it's like you need a new chapter that helps us understand, helps set up this other point a little bit better. And that's kind of the scale of the things you're working with. And it could also be like all the dialogue for this character is fairly wooden and maybe they need a little more personality in there, or maybe this character doesn't have high enough stakes. Those are the sorts of elements that are going to be looked at and adjusted at the developmental editing stage.
One of the reasons that you're needing or doing developmental editing is that when you get your manuscript back from us, you'll have a lot of work to do. If we've been copy editing or line editing or something, we're doing your work for you. If we're doing developmental editing, you've got your work cut out for you.
I'm not sure if this is with everyone, but we also look at the marketability of the book with Eschler Editing and make suggestions for how they can write more to market with the book that they already have.
At Future House, we specifically publish family-friendly books, so our developmental editing stage will also include removing any non-family-friendly content that was in the manuscript when it was submitted. So that also happens usually at that stage. Not like swearing and stuff, because we can pull that out later, but any like scenes that happen in a bar or stuff like that. If there was children that died in the story, we can't send that to schools because they very much don't like death of children in their libraries. So we would edit that sort of stuff out in the developmental edit stage as well, because then while we're changing those sort of large scale things, we can fix the plot around them. Whereas if we took them out later, it could leave big holes. That would be a huge problem.
Yeah, great. That's a great summary of the kind of things that are handled in the developmental editing phase. So my next question for you guys is that a lot of writers do get really excited when they finish their book, and sometimes they're just not sure if they're ready for that or if they need to go through some other editing process first. So how do people know when they're ready for developmental editing? If it's too soon or maybe they should have done it sooner? What do you guys think?
Go ahead. Or I'll go. I think for anybody, it's really important to run it through your writing group and your beta readers first to get the biggest bang for your buck. If you're bringing it to the developmental editor first, then that you're going to get it's going to be a quicker process, but you're going to have to pay a lot more money in the long run because you might need to take it to a developmental editor again. So I guess if you're willing to pay a lot, then that could be okay. But other than that, I really think you should have a writing group look at it, have beta readers look at it, and when you feel really strongly about it is when you should take it to developmental editing.
I think it's not necessarily true. Oh, sorry.
No, go ahead. I want to hear what you're saying about.
I think it's not necessarily true that it's faster if you go to a developmental editor first, because if you don't really have your plot kind of worked out in your head where you're going with the story, then if you go to a developmental editor, they might be like, hey, you have this huge gap here that you're going to have to then brainstorm and solve these problems. And sometimes that can be a slower, longer process than if you were sitting there in the room with your writing group, because usually your developmental editor is not in the room with you. So if you kind of can work out some of your larger scale goals and what it is that you're expecting this book to be before you get to the developmental editor, that process can go a lot faster and you can use their expertise a lot better.
So one of the things that makes talking about developmental editing a little awkward or a little confusing for a lot of authors is that developmental editing is a broad term. And some editors, some editing outfits will actually distinguish between giving you sort of like a story critique and actual developmental editing. And so I very strongly recommend, it's never too soon to talk to a developmental editor and get sort of a general story critique, the kind of thing that that we're talking about right now. In fact, it will save you a ton of time. If you have this great idea for a story and you've kind of roughed it out, as soon as there's enough of it so that there's something coherent for us to look at and understand, and run it by one of us quickly or someone like us and get some feedback from us. And this can be in a meeting that takes no more than 15 minutes. At the Writers Society that I'm a part of in Los Angeles, we have something called Pro Critiques, which are these kinds of 15-minute things. And it will save you a ton of time. It could save you a year of developmental work to get a little bit of feedback at the very beginning. But then some people will say, well, that's not really developmental editing, but it's under the larger umbrella.
Yeah, I think especially in nonfiction, developmental editing can mean something different. Developmental editing can mean looking at an outline and giving feedback on how to develop the actual book that will eventually come of it. And it can also, on the other side, mean taking a full book and developing it further. And so it is important to know what you're getting when you sign up for developmental editing, just because there is that fuzziness in terminology use. And there are ways to get large scale feedback without paying for the strict developmental edit. A lot of people distinguish between, like Nic has mentioned, the story critique, but also a manuscript evaluation where someone reads your whole book and they give general feedback on it. And it could be very extensive feedback and very useful feedback, but they're not going to be going on every single page, writing up a review of every single chapter. It's going to be more generalized to the entire book. And so you can generally get that sort of feedback for a lot cheaper. And that might be something I get into a little earlier if you're like, I don't know if I'm ready. And I think I'm ready, but I'm not sure. It can be hard to be willing to commit to the process of a full developmental edit on an entire manuscript. And so there are smaller steps you can take to practice the skills you need to use a developmental edit. You need to sharpen your revision skills, your ability to take feedback and incorporate it into your vision. Those are all skills that you need for a developmental edit to be helpful. And you can practice those skills with critique groups, with alpha readers, with beta readers. You can practice those with a story critique, with a manuscript evaluation. You can do a bunch of smaller steps to build the skills you'd need to really get the value out of a developmental edit.
Yeah, great thoughts. I love how you've all pointed out that there's kind of these different levels and that it's important to like set expectations about what you're expecting from a developmental edit when you get to that point. And there's lots of different options for how you can get to that point. So let's say a writer really does feel confident, like I'm ready for a developmental edit. How do they know where to find a good editor that is right for them? And what's the process of hiring a developmental editor?
There are lots of ways. One of the best ways is to talk to other writers you know and see if they have anyone that they recommend. There are lots of ways online to find people. You can just Google, but really all Google tells you is who has the best SEO. And sometimes that means they're the best editor, and sometimes it just means they're amazing at SEO. And you can look at databases like the Freelance Editors Association. That's at the-efa.org. They have a database of editors. You can look at ACE is mostly copy editors, but some of them do developmental editing. So that's the American Copy Editors Society. Here locally, we have the Utah Freelance Editors Club, which we have a database that only gets updated once a quarter. So like, don't be judgy about it. I'm the webmaster. So you can go to those databases to start your search, but you really need to investigate each person. And that just works a lot faster when you can ask your network. Be like, hey, have you ever worked with a developmental editor, or do you know anyone you'd recommend? You can kind of vet the editors a lot faster that way, which is great. And you can also, you contact them, let them know about your project. You can get a sample edit on a portion of your manuscript. Some editors offer that for free. Some do not. It's not necessarily a red flag one way or another. Some editors just have the time to do those free samples. And some of them, like I sometimes get 10 to 15 requests a week, and I just can't do a free sample edit for that many. I don't have that kind of time. But I also don't think it's bad that other people do free samples. Like it just kind of depends. And so you can get samples from different editors to try to see who really gets you and provides feedback in a way that works for you. Because just because someone's an awesome editor doesn't mean they're the right kind of awesome for you. And that's fine. It's important that you find the right fit.
Kind of expanding on the whole right fit idea. One of the things that a developmental editor is going to bring as their expertise is knowledge of the industry, knowledge of the genre, and knowledge of the age range. So even if someone is an amazing adult horror developmental editor, they might have no idea what to do with your middle grade fantasy novel, and their expertise is not going to be useful for you as far as what publishers are looking for, what readers are looking for, what bookstores are going to put on their shelves, any of that sort of advice. So you want to make sure that you know what your book is, or at least what you're roughly assuming your book is, and find an editor who specializes specifically in that. And that's just as important as them being a good editor and being a good fit for you as far as like personalities and communication styles.
On a side note, if you are publishing with a press and not self-publishing, or like not doing a developmental edit prior to going with agents, you might not have as much of a choice as far as who your developmental editor is. But I still think that you should do research on your editor, find out what books they've done, and kind of get a vibe for the comments that they're going to present to you. And if you're with a small press, you might actually have the opportunity to request. With my publisher, I don't know if you guys know Lindsay Flanagan, but she's a really amazing editor, and I knew her personally, and so I made sure that I requested her as my editor because I knew that she would turn out great. You might have a chance even if you're going with a publisher. So like, make sure to try.
And by the way, that's an important thing that Kristy's already talked about. That the chemistry between you and the editor is really important. You need to find, especially with developmental editing, but really, I guess for any kind of editing that's more sophisticated than a basic proofread, you want to find an editor who gets you and who, obviously, like you said, understands your genre and everything, but also someone who kind of understands your author voice and understands what you're trying to accomplish, and seems like they're able to help you accomplish that. And I guess the best way to do that is to get to know us. Like for example, coming to writers conferences like this. And here you're talking with 5 of us right now, and you're hearing our different personalities and our different backgrounds and our different focuses and things. And I hope you're probably, coming up with ideas about which one of us might be in the future sometime a good editor for your work. Or you might be crossing all of us off your list and wishing that you could talk to someone like Russell Nolte, who's salty and straight shooter and all that. I don't know.
Well, and you can do those sort of personality screenings by reading an editor's website. If they have a website or if they use social media, you can read those things. Like, you can go to my website and you can see my specialties. And on my FAQ, I have like, what am I the best fit for? And I talk about the type of things I'm a good fit for. And then I'm like, what am I a terrible fit for? And I'm like, I don't do developmental editing on romance. I like romance. I copy edit romance, but I don't emphasize in it enough that I trust myself to do a developmental edit. So, like, a lot of times editors will help you know what's a good fit because they don't want to waste your time and they don't want to waste their time either. So they're not going to say, I'm the best at everything. Like, they might, but that seems not super helpful.
If someone
Any
says
editor
that,
who tells you that they can edit anything is lying to you, and just skip them. That's
I
a bad
agree,
sign.
100%. None of us will ever say that. Yeah.
It's a bad sign. And most editors, if you find an editor who's a good personality fit, but they don't know your genre, sometimes it could still be good to reach out to them and say, hey, like, you seem like the kind of person I'd like to work with, but I do horror and you don't seem to like horror at all. Do you know anybody who is kind of like you, but specializes in horror? Because I know, a lot of freelance editors, we're technically competitors, but we feed each other work all the time when it's like, oh, I'm not good at this, but I know that Emma is, or I am too busy and I know someone else who also does what I do, and you can hand it off. And we do that all the time. And so asking for referrals from editors can also be helpful.
Yeah. And, Wordsmith Writing Coaches, we've got 8 editors, including myself. We have 8 on our team. And all of us are different. All of us have different focuses and different strengths and different backgrounds and things. And even though we have 8 people on our team, because we have 8 people on our team, and I've sort of take all the incoming requests and things, I'm able to do a free initial consultation with pretty much anybody. I may need to schedule you a couple weeks out if I'm super busy, but we do free initial consultations, and in that initial consultation, I'll tell you right then, yeah, I know this other editor, so even though we have 8 of us and we have a wide variety of backgrounds and focuses and everything and specialties, we still send work out to colleagues. It really is, editing is a lot more collegial than you might think, partly because the demand is so overwhelming. None of us could ever handle it. There's just no point really in being competitive because our clients are all going to they kind of gravitate towards us. And so we want to help you with that gravitation process. And that's why things like this conference happen.
Awesome. Any last thoughts on that from anybody? Cool. Great. All right. Well, let's talk a little bit more about some of the specific things you look for in a developmental edit. For instance, I know the developmental edits often handle how the hook goes, the plot, the different characters and their arcs. What are some similar issues that come up a lot in developmental edits that our writers can be aware of that they can also kind of look for in their own books?
Someone else want to talk first?
One thing that I spend a lot of time catching in developmental edits is when the goals are not clear early on in the story. And so I'll get to the end, I'll read the climax, and I'll be like, cool, that's not where I thought the story was going at all. And then make suggestions earlier on in the story to make sure that it's clear in each scene as the character is getting closer and closer to that goal, what it is they're trying to do and how that relates back to their, initial setup at the beginning and how that's eventually going to lead them into the climax. Because it's all set up in there, but sometimes it's not actually put into the page what those goals are.
I think some of the issues I see a lot with the beginnings is that they start too early in the book. Another issue that I see a lot with the beginning is that they don't introduce enough about the character at the beginning. You don't get to know the character from the get-go. And another issue that I see a lot in beginnings is it doesn't properly establish the genre from the beginning. I think with the middles, an issue that I see a lot is that they just get too muddy. It can drag on and the pacing gets too slow. And then with the ending, I think a similar problem is that like you're trying to build up the climax and it's not fast-paced enough, or that it's like very explosive and there's like all these crazy things going on and it doesn't properly fulfill the promises that were made at the beginning of what would happen at the end. So those are some like really big picture issues that I see a lot.
I think one thing that I do a lot is, and some of it may be that I tend to get people who are coming for manuscript evaluations, so they're earlier in their process. And a lot of it is like the characters aren't fully developed, and so they can't really carry the story. So I'll try to help authors iron out like, okay, where is this character starting? Where do you want them to end? What arc do you want them to have? And how can we seed little bits of that arc throughout the narrative? Because a lot of times authors have these amazing ideas for the theme and arc of their character, but it kind of goes from like, I'm grumpy and I hate everything, and I'm grumpy and I hate everything, and I'm grumpy and I hate everything. And then in the climax, like, oh, people are worthy of love. And you jumped too far and you didn't get enough like little choices along the way to help guide that. And so some of it is helping authors clarify what arc they want, and some of it is helping them seed the arc throughout the entire piece instead of just having it jump to, oh wait, this character isn't just going to be the sarcastic I hate everybody all the time person forever. Like they were supposed to change, like, and it can come out of nowhere, but they're brilliant ideas. And it's just helping the author really kind of clear out the things that are hiding those great ideas that they have, and helping clarify them and polish them up.
Yeah, absolutely. And one of the things that developmental editing can help you do, I'm thinking of one particular client who came to me with an idea for a memoir. And 30 minutes into our initial consultation, 30 minutes into our conversation, I said, now, I'm not sure this is a memoir. What would you think about publishing this as a coffee table book full of photographs? And all these little vignettes that you're telling me could be on like the facing page or something. These are really extended captions for the photography you've done, because that author happened to be a professional photographer of celebrities. And long story short, it's published now as a photo book, as a coffee table book, and Wordsmith Writing Coaches had nothing to do with it because we don't do coffee table books.
That's awesome. That's some great insight into some of the things that writers will be working on in their own stories, and just how broad and varied these things can be. So as someone mentioned that writers have a lot of work to do after they get their developmental edits back. So I guess along with that, do you guys see a sort of pattern in how many rounds of a developmental edit some writers need? Do you usually just need one round? Do you need multiple? Does that change? What could writers expect?
Do you mind if I go first on this one? So, okay, we said earlier how developmental editing is kind of a broad umbrella, and it encompasses a lot of different things that we might do for you. But it's also a leaky umbrella. Like it's not a. So even when we're doing line editing for you, every once in a while we'll put margin comments where when we did the manuscript critique for you, we weren't going paragraph by paragraph through the entire thing, and then here we realize, there's a whole scene here that's missing, so you need to add this scene. So technically that's could be labeled developmental editing, but it's going to come up in the line edit. And so when it really depends how many times we swap your manuscript back and forth, do a pass and we'll send it back to you and you'll fix things and we'll send it back to us. And then we do it's more like you're letting the clutch out, where we were focusing on developmental editing, and then, there is a friction point. There is a friction point between developmental stuff and then now we're just doing the line edit. All the pieces are in place. It's arranged properly. Now we're just trying to make it good, like it's whole now, and now we're trying to make it good. But there's still going to be opportunities for revision. It depends. I think the client that I had the most rounds with was like, I lost track at like 12. And I believe I worked with that one client on that one book for 5 straight years. And there were hiatuses in the middle. She had a serious medical problem and was in the hospital for 6 weeks and all kinds of crazy stuff. But she never gave up on her book, and it's published today. And but then, other times, it's a textbook scenario. We'll do one developmental edit, and then 6 months later, the client comes back and we'll do one copy edit and with maybe a couple of developmental notes in there. And then they accept the changes or fix things, and then they send it back to us, and we do one proofread, and then they start querying agents. So it really depends.
Yeah, it can vary a lot, and some of it varies on some of the variables that feed into it is your budget. I mean, like, can you afford to go through that many developmental edits? Some of it depends on your skill level. There are some authors who are so good at revision that all they need is one manuscript evaluation and they will fix it and it'll be done because their drafts are so solid and their revision skills are so solid, and that's all they need. And some books for the same author will just be hugely difficult, and it could be their 6th book and they're like, I can't make this one work, and it takes them 6 rounds of developmental editing, and that's also fine. You have to take it on a case-by-case basis. There are also, like, I've had clients like the one Nic mentioned where I've worked with them on the same manuscript for years until I actually got to the point where I'm like, I can no longer tell what's good or bad anymore because I can't remember what's happened in this manuscript and what got cut. And so we need to find you somebody else because I can't have fresh eyes on this anymore. But I've also had people who they get one round of edits and they revise the best they can with the skills they have. And then it's time to stop and maybe try a new book and build those skills with a different book instead of beating book 1 to death. And that's okay too. It really varies depending on each book. So it's hard to say, like, you need 6 rounds of developmental editing or you only ever need 1. It just depends.
As far as, like, if you have budget concerns, which most people have some sort of a budget they're working on, if, like, the newer an author you are, or the more like this one particular book is giving you trouble, the more you can get like a manuscript critique or something on the cheaper end first and get some of those larger problems out of the way, the less rounds of developmental editing you're going to need. Because if you go into like a full-scale developmental edit and they're like, hey, like the last one I did, I recommended a manuscript critique. And then she was like, no, like, let's go developmental. And I was like, okay, it's your money. Like, I'll do it. But I ended up telling her that she didn't have a climax. She had to pull that out of book 2. And there were 8 chapters in the middle that she had to just cut. And so by the time she'd made those changes, it was a completely different book. And, like, I had never read what her new climax was. So I couldn't be like, oh, yeah, you're good now, because I'd never read her climax. And so she obviously had to come back and do another developmental edit at that point. And if she'd done a manuscript critique, she probably could have caught some of those things so that when I got the manuscript, I could do developmental edit on the version that had a climax, and then she would have needed less passes on that to end up with her final story. So if you don't know if you're not quite as sure about your book, or you're newer at this and you don't know how to apply these revisions as well, and you are going to need someone to read it again in order to see if you've accomplished the things you've been told to do, then start out with those cheaper forms of editing to try to catch as much of that as possible, so that when you have someone actually go through, they're reading that more final version.
Hear, hear.
I feel like I'm really sensitive to spending people's money, and I only want to spend it if I know I can be helpful. And so I've definitely turned manuscripts away where I've said, hey, like, you need to go take this to your writing group first. I can't do developmental edit on this right now.
Yeah, thank you so much for your thoughts, everybody. And going along with this, a question actually just popped up in the chat that I was planning to ask. So this is good timing, I think. When writers do find they do need like multiple rounds or things like that, what strategies could they implement to be better at revision? So maybe they don't need as many rounds of editing, or can just improve their skills overall. How can they improve at revising?
Alpha and beta readers, writing groups, critique partners. Because if you're finding other people who also need feedback and you're exchanging feedback, then no one's taking advantage of anybody else. You're doing an equal exchange of your time and your effort, and that's awesome and great. And so you can do that indefinitely. Like, and it's an exchange of time, which is sometimes easier for people to part with than money, depending on what their time and money constraints are. And so you can spend that time practicing those skills. You can spend that time hearing feedback and be like, does that apply to what I actually want in my book? Or does it just point out a problem that I need to fix, but I need to fix in my own way? Or does that apply to if I were writing romance, but I'm actually writing, like sword and sorcery fantasy? And so it gives you that practice filtering feedback, making sure it matches your vision of the book, which helps you solidify your vision of the book. Sometimes authors have a really great idea for a story and then they get it done, but they've spent a year drafting it. And so they kind of lose sight of what the big picture things are. And so working with, a writing community, your writing group, alpha and beta readers, critique partners, whether those are other people who are writers or people who are just readers who want to help you out, practicing getting that feedback and trying to put it into practice, and then getting feedback on what you've done after that can really help you hone those skills. And I highly recommend you do that before you invest in a full developmental edit.
And along those notes, I think it's just really important that you listen to them once you get feedback from them. I know some people are very stubborn.
Shut your mouth and open your ears. That's rule number 1.
Yes. And and obviously, like, if one person says it, it could be an outlier, which is why it's good to get feedback from not like a ton of people, but at least some people. And if you have like 3 people saying the same thing, then yeah, you really should pay attention to that feedback note. But I have seen a lot with like my own writing groups. It can be challenging for some people, especially new writers, when they get that feedback. They're trying to fix it, but they're just not quite there yet. And so I think one thing that's really important to remember is, like, sometimes even if someone puts something that's like a small comment, but it's like a major issue, like this is an issue that requires a change of the character, or it requires you to fix a plot hole, like adding a sentence to try to justify it may not fix the problem. Because I've seen that happen a lot, where it's like, okay, they have all these questions throughout, I'm just going to go through and answer all. The character is off or whatever. So things like that, keep in mind.
Yeah, I think some of the skills you're going to need to apply edits to your book are learning how just to hear feedback, not even like to use it, but just to hear it, and emotionally process that, and then go and logistically process that. Like, writing is, very much a work of passion and of love, and it can be really hard to hear that. So first, learn how to just hear that anything is less than perfect about your book, and make sure you have that skill, because if that is still too painful for you, and you just can't get over that, you are not ready for an editor. It's not going to be helpful to you. And then once you've accepted that there are things that are less than perfect about your book, then you have to learn how to pick and choose, like they were saying, which feedback makes sense for your book. And then you also have to kind of think, okay, so if someone's noticing this problem in my book, maybe I don't want to fix it exactly the way they say, because it's still your book. And so you have to learn how to identify a problem and something that's not happening in your manuscript or not coming across the way that you mean it to, and come up with a fix that you personally like and something that you're excited about putting into your book that still solves that problem. and not just making changes because someone's like, oh, this chapter's boring, or like, oh, this chapter's a problem for pacing. And you're like, okay, like I'll just delete this chapter and write a more exciting chapter. But maybe that new exciting chapter doesn't actually have anything to do with your plot and will be just as problematic. So you have to keep that problem in mind and find a solution that you're excited about. And both of those things have to be happening at the same time.
Yes.
Once you have that skill, you can take developmental editing feedback a lot better.
Just to go along with that, in Writing Excuses, where Brandon Sanderson and other big authors talk about how in your writing group and your beta readers, they're not necessarily good at prescribing you. They're not very good at being the doctor and saying, like, this is what you need to do to fix the problem. They're more good at saying, like, there's a problem here. So a lot of the time you'll get those prescriptions, or they'll say, you should do this, or you should change your hook by saying this. You need to pay attention to like more of the feedback of like this, of like there is a diagnosis here, like you're sick here, like this part is broken, but you have to figure out how to solve it. But if you have an editor, they can help you figure out how to solve it because they are the doctor.
But even then, I have clients who come up with way better solutions than I could because it's their book and they have a lot more thoughts about it than I do because I've spent, like a few weeks with it and they've spent a year with it. And so even though I might recommend, some perfectly serviceable solutions to their problem, I am often delighted with the very different solutions my authors come up with, where they're like, oh, well, there's this thing I could do and I could plant it earlier in the book. And I'm like, yeah, that totally fixes that problem late in the book. And it's way better than what I came up with because it better fits your theme and your voice and your characters. And that's always awesome.
Yeah, this is especially true in literary fiction. Whenever I'm editing literary fiction, I come upon a problem like that. I do try to give some specific, suggestions, but I always try to give at least two, and always, I just keep repeating in the margin comments a caveat, maybe something like this, or, see if you can come up with your own solution to this problem. Here are two possibilities, but I don't know, what would be the best way to do this. Because literary fiction is, it's almost like really, really long prose poetry. And it absolutely requires the author to at the very least put their own spin on. Well, everybody will put their own spin on it, but anyway, blah. Go ahead. Someone else talk.
Really great thoughts. Yeah, go ahead, Kristy.
Are we going to pivot to questions now?
That's what I was going to suggest. Unless anybody has any last thoughts they want to go on, I think we're ready to go ahead and take a question from the chat.
I have just one last thing. I know authors sometimes are confused why editors offer suggestions if we don't actually want you to follow our suggestions exactly. And as an editor, I have tried both editing styles just with different authors, because sometimes I've had authors who just took my suggestions way too literally. So I tried not offering suggestions, and then they just sat there and kind of stared at the problem and were like, I have no idea what to do with this. But if I offered a suggestion, they could be like, oh, I hate that. Can we do this instead? And it would work way better. So, us as editors are trying to help you start the brainstorming process. We're trying to be helpful. And so, in general, we will offer suggestions for things, but those suggestions are not offered because that's the only solution. It's because, as far as authors go, having a suggestion can usually clarify, like, this is what the problem actually is, rather than, using our editor speak to do it. We can give an example of something that would fix it. And it just helps the communication process and helps the brainstorming process get started.
Yeah, that's a great point, Emma. Thank you. Yeah, let's go ahead and take a question now.
Cadence asks, how long would a developmental edit take, and how do you determine what to charge?
Yes. That's exactly how we determine what to charge. We need to see your manuscript. We need to talk with you ahead of time to figure out what the scope of work is going to be, because, this is, as you get further and further all across that spectrum, starting with developmental editing and all the other stuff that's jumbled into that, and you get closer and closer to just proofreading, like proofreading I mean, I don't even need to see your manuscript. I can quote. Well, no, I actually do, because your manuscript might be horrible. But if I just just page. Oh yeah, coherent sentences. Here's your quote. But developmental editing, oh my gosh! I mean, it so depends on just everything. So talk to us.
Yeah. I'm still figuring this out. I'm still trying to figure out how to price developmental editing and how long it takes. And it does depend a lot on the manuscript. But to be realistic about it, if I'm doing a developmental edit, I'm reading that manuscript at least twice for one round. Like, I'm going to read through it once, and then I'm going to read through it again and really compile all my notes and put them together. And so if you just think about how long it takes you to read an epic fantasy novel twice when you're not taking notes, take that and at least double it. And that's the time that you're taking, because you're giving it the attention and you're writing stuff up and you're taking notes and you're spending time thinking about it while you're doing the dishes and all those other things. And I've gone back and forth on my pricing. I used to be like, oh, I need to see your manuscript. But then people got sticker shock when they saw how much it cost, because I wasn't giving any ballpark figure. Last year I had my pricing per word, but I had it based on the idea that I do one round with you and then you do revisions and then we do another round. This year I'm trying out per word pricing, but it's per round. So like, we'll do a round, you'll revise. And then if you want another round, we contract that separately. And I don't know. I'm seeing how it goes. I'm still experimenting.
Yeah. I used to do per word. Now I do per hour. Like, I honestly do per hour. And some people are like, what? Do per the hour? I'm not, I guarantee I am not going to cheat you.
Yeah, I've gone back and forth on the per hour and per word. Like, I used to really like per hour because then I wasn't overcharging anybody, because when you do per word, you have to average it out.
Exactly.
But then it got way too difficult for me to manage all the quotes, because I'm like a one-person shop most of the time. And so I don't have like an assistant to field all the onboarding questions or anything. And so it just got too difficult to manage all the quotes. And so pivoting to a per word price was a lot easier for me, because people can just figure out themselves what their thing is going to cost and decide if it's within their price range, and then talk to me or not talk to me as appropriate. So that's what works for me right now. That might not be the same thing I do in 5 years. We'll see.
One of the people on my team is a retired studio executive and screenwriter, and the way that she does her pricing is you send her your script. She's the screenwriter person, and she literally spends maybe 3 minutes like scrolling through your PDF or your, not PDF, I don't know, whatever scripty people use to send scripts, that format. And she scrolls through it for like 3 minutes, and she just blurts out a number. She just pulls it out of the air. I'm like, how do you come up with that number? And she says, I don't know. I've been doing this for 45 years. I just come up with a number.
She just knows.
Whatever. Sure. Yeah. So it could be anything. And I'm glad that you're hearing us have this conversation so that you know how we're thinking. I mean, if you have a preference, you can suggest it. Sorry.
Yeah. Any thoughts from Amy or Emma on this?
So with mine, I do just look over like some of the book to try to decide on a price based off of like where the book is at. But I do a set price for anybody that wants first chapter critiques, or I'll send like a couple page letter and edit the first chapter for $80. So that's like very set. But other than that, everything really is dependent.
In my freelance stuff, I've always done by word, firstly because hourly quotes can be just so complicated, because if it takes a ridiculous amount of extra hours, then you have to negotiate that and deal with that kind of as the editing is happening, and the client doesn't know like what the quote is going to end up being, which can just be more stressful and complicated for everybody. So having that kind of set price based on the initial word count can just be easier to manage, like contractually, and then easier for the client to like know ahead of time what they're going to pay. But it does kind of mean you have to inflate your rates a little bit, just in case it takes on the longer end of stuff. And there's only so much you can tell from reading the first couple of pages about whether or not the book is going to have any kind of a climax at the end, or you're going to have to suggest that, So, there is a little bit of an additional cost in the per word pricing, but at least you know what that cost is going to be.
Yeah, thank you. All right, let's take another question from the chat.
Linz asks, do you have a relationship with agents and can refer ideas to where writers should submit their work after they complete your edits?
I do. Yes.
I do not. I know of lots of agents and their specialties, but I don't know any of them personally. And so sometimes if someone asks me, I can say, here are a few good ideas, but I can't guarantee that they're like the best ideas in the industry for you. That's not one of my realms of expertise anymore. I used to keep up on it better, but I don't as much anymore.
I'm kind of in the small press community, so there's not a lot of agents, and most of the agents that I do work with, honestly, I wouldn't recommend. They're not helping your book out. They're places you could have submitted by yourself, and you would have been just fine. So I might have publisher recommendations, but not agents.
Oh, Nic, did you have a thought?
So I was waving at someone else off camera. Sorry. I'm still busy. I've been at this for a while now, and I make a point, not in a crass way, I hope, but I do make a point of trying to get to know, find out who the best agents are for various genres or various kinds of publications, and getting to know them, and just checking in with them now and then, asking them what they're looking for, and they're always happy. I mean, I want them to know who Wordsmith Writing Coaches is, because sometimes they will refer work to me. By the way, if you query an agent, if you send something to an agent and they look at it and they recommend that you talk to an editor, do it, please, because these agents know a lot of editors. I'm sorry, yes?
Yes, I agree with that, but you should make sure that the agent isn't getting any sort of kickback on that. Because
I didn't even think of that.
There are scam agent editor people who just feed each other work and get kickbacks on it, and they'll just send authors on a runaround. So it's great because you get good referrals, and it can be good referrals from amazing agents to amazing editors, but just make sure you do your research, check out Writer Beware. Don't get yourself caught in one of those scam loops.
Yes.
And it's hard because it can look somewhat legitimate, because there are legitimate referrals that happen, but don't get caught in that, because that's terrible.
I'm so glad that you brought that up, because I am just not in that world at all, because and I'm glad you brought that up, because one of the best ways, I mean, yes, Writer Beware, but that's a great site. And get involved with a writers society or writers association or something like that in your region. Like, really get involved, join a critique group, or go to their, I don't know, whatever that writers. I'm part of the Greater Los Angeles Writers Society, and it's awesome. And one of the things that groups like that will do for you, also Independent Writers of Southern California is another group in my region that is excellent at this. And they one of the things they do is make sure that all the agents that they know, or that they invite to their conferences, or that they list on their websites, are legit people. And the editors too, that they list on their websites or that they invite to their conferences, are legit people. And they will keep a private list of charlatans. So if you're part of a group like that, you can tap into that group wisdom in so many ways, in this particular question, and in so many other ways too. I very, very strongly recommend that you join an association or a society or whatever it's called in your region. Or heck, now, I mean, welcome to the age of COVID. You can you can join the Greater Los Angeles Writers Society. We've got a member in Auckland, New Zealand now who's joined the Greater Los Angeles Writers Society because he got to know us on virtual conferences like this. And anyway.
As far as writer societies, one thing I would recommend is make sure that you're joining one that is actual published authors, whether that's self-published or through publishers, because there are some writing society people out there.
Preferably both.
Just a bunch of people who are not published, and they're going to give you really crap advice that makes no sense, and they're turning down publishing contracts because of these royalties that they're never going to get offered for anyone, and you don't want that kind of bad advice. So make sure that they're actual published authors or actual people from the publishing community who are actually involved in the industry.
Oh, thank you so much. These are all great thoughts. We've run out of time, and I know there are still some questions in the chat, so I don't know if anybody's able to stay and hopefully answer some of those in the chat. Maybe we can.
I have another panel to get to, but I'll pop over and post contact information for everybody who is on this panel if you want to visit any of our websites or check out any of our books. That'll be over in the chat in like a minute after we close out.
Yeah, perfect. All right. Well, thank you all so much for joining us, and let's go ahead and end our panel.